Every time you open a website, your browser communicates with a server somewhere in the world. But what language do they use to communicate? How does HTTP protect your data? And where does a website actually live on the internet? Let's understand all of that in this video. In the previous video, we saw how the web works at a high level. When you type a website URL, your browser first finds the server using DNS, then sends a request to the server and receives files like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So we understood what happens when a web page loads, but we didn't talk about how the browser and server actually communicate. What language do they use? What rules do they follow when sending requests and responses? That's where HTTP comes in. So what is HTTP? HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. It is the set of rules that allows your browser and a web server to communicate with each other. It is used whenever a web page is requested. Whenever you open a website, your browser sends something called an HTTP request to the server. This request tells the server which resource the browser wants to access. The server then sends back a HTTP response which contains the website data such as HTML, CSS, JavaScript, images, and other resources. Let's now look at what an HTTP request actually contains. An HTTP request contains several important parts. First is the method, which tells the server what action the browser wants to perform. For example, get to retrieve data or post to send data. Next is a URL, which specifies the resource the browser is requesting. Then we have headers, which include additional information about the request, such as the browser type or the data format. And sometimes a request also includes a body, which contains data being sent to the server. For example, when submitting a form. Now let's look at a simple example of an HTTP request. Here, if you see, the word get is the HTTP method which tells the server that the browser wants to retrieve data. The slash symbol represents the root page of the website. So this request is basically asking the server to send the main page of the website. Next, HTTP slash 1.1 indicates the version of the HTTP protocol being used. And finally, the host header tells the server which website should be served, in this case youtube.com. Now let's look at what happens after the server receives the HTTP request. Basically, it processes the request, retrieves the required data, and prepares the response. It then sends back something called an HTTP response. At the top of the response, we see the status line. In this example, it says HTTP slash 1.1 200 OK. This tells the browser that the request was successful. We'll explore more about these HTTP status codes in the next part. Next, the response includes headers, which provide additional information about the page, about the response basically. So, for example, the content type header tells the browser what type of data is being sent. Here it says text HTML, which means the server is sending an HTML document. Then we have charset UTF-8 that tells the browser which character encoding is used to represent the text in the document. Then the content length header indicates the size of the response data. After the headers comes the response body. This is where the actual web page content is sent. In this example, the server sends HTML code that defines the structure of the web page, including the title and a link to a CSS style sheet. Once the browser receives this response, it reads the HTML, loads any CSS and JavaScript files, and then renders the final web page that the user sees. HTTP responses also include something called status codes. These codes tell the browser whether the request was successful or if something went wrong. Status codes are grouped into 5 main categories based on their first digit. Codes starting with 1 are informational responses. They indicate that the request has been received and the process is continuing. Codes starting with 2 indicate success. For example, 200 OK means the request was successful and the server returned the requested data. Codes starting with 3 represent redirection. This means the resource has moved to another location. For example, 301 moved permanently or 302 found. Codes starting with 4 indicate client errors. This means there is something wrong with the request sent by the browser. For example, 400 bad request, 401 unauthorized or 404 not found. Finally, codes starting with 5 indicate server errors. This means the problem occurred on the server side. Example include 500 internal server error and 503 service unavailable. These status codes help the browsers and developers understand what happened when a request was made. You may have noticed a small lock icon in your browser's address bar. This means the website is using HTTPS. HTTPS stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure. It is simply HTTP with an added layer of security. HTTPS encrypts the data that is being transferred between your browser and the server. This encryption is provided by technologies called SSL and TLS, which are security protocols designed to protect communication over the internet. The purpose of HTTPS is that they create a secure connection between the browser and the server so that the data being exchanged cannot be easily intercepted or read. This is especially important when you enter sensitive information such as passwords, credit card details, personal information, etc. And that's why almost every modern website today uses HTTPS. Now let's talk about hosting. In the previous video, we have understood that a website must live somewhere on the internet. That somewhere is called a server. Now, hosting is the service that allows a website to be stored on the server and made accessible on the internet. When you buy hosting, you are basically renting a space on the server that is connected to the internet 24/7. This server stores your website files, including HTML, CSS, JavaScript, images, and other resources. When someone visits your website, the server sends those files to the user's browser. Some popular hosting providers include AWS, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, Hostinger, GoDaddy, etc. These companies provide servers that deliver website to users all around the world. Moving on, when building websites, developers usually work with two main parts, frontend and backend. Frontend is everything the user sees and interacts within the browser. This includes technologies like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and framework like Angular or React. Now let's look at the backend. The backend is the part of a web application that runs on the server. Unlike the front end, users usually don't see the backend directly. The backend is responsible for handling the core logic of the application. It manages things like business logic, which defines how the application behaves. It also interacts with databases where application data is stored and retrieved. Another important responsibility is authentication, which verifies user identities when they log in. And the backend often exposes API, which allow the front end to communicate with the server and request data. To build backend system, Developers use technologies such as C Sharp with .NET, Node.js, and Python, along with various database systems. Together, these technologies allow the server to process requests, manage data, and send responses back to the front end. Now, let's see how the front end and back end work together through a user login example. First, the user enters their username and password in the login form of a website. Okay, this information is collected by the front end. Next, the front end sends this data as a request to the backend server. The backend then processes this request and checks the database to see if the user exists and whether the credentials are valid. After verifying the information, the backend prepares a response. It then sends this response back to the front end, indicating whether the login was successful or not. Finally, the front end displays the result to the user, for example, showing a welcome message if the login is successful. This interaction between the front end, back end, and database is what powers most modern web applications. Now let's understand another important concept in the web development, the difference between static and dynamic websites. Websites can generally be divided into two types, static websites and dynamic websites. A static website contains fixed content that is the same for every visitor. For example, a portfolio website or a simple landing page. A dynamic website, on the other hand, generates content based on user actions or data from a database. Examples include YouTube, Instagram, Amazon. Usually, dynamic websites require backend logic and databases. And most modern web applications today are dynamic websites because they personalize content and interact with user data. Moving on to the last topic of this video, this is the concept that every beginner must know, how browsers render web page. In the previous video, we learned about the browser's job. The browser sends a request to the server, receives the response, and then displays it as a website. But how does the browser actually convert those files into the web page we see? Because receiving the file is not the last step. Even after the browser downloads the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files, it still needs to build the uh, web page that you actually see on the screen. So this process is called rendering, and it is this process through which the browser constructs and displays the final web page. Now let's understand how it's done. First, the browser reads the HTML document and parses it. From this HTML, the browser builds a structure called DOM, or the document object model, which represents the elements of the web page as a tree. We will learn more about this DOM in the upcoming videos. Next, the browser processes the CSS styles. These styles determine how each element should look, including things like colors, fonts, sizes, and layout. Then comes JavaScript, which adds interactivity to the page. JavaScript can respond to user actions like clicks, modify the content, and update the page dynamically. Finally, the browser combines the HTML structure, the CSS styling, and the JavaScript behavior to render the final web page you see on your screen. And the amazing part is that this entire process happens incredibly fast, usually in just a few milliseconds. Let's quickly summarize what we covered in this video. We started by understanding what HTTP is, the protocol that allows browsers and servers to communicate. Then we looked at the structure of an HTTP request and the structure of an HTTP response and how these messages are exchanged between the browser and the server. After that, we explored HTTP status codes, which indicate the result of a request, whether it was informational, successful, redirected, or resulted in a client or server error. Next, we discussed the difference between HTTP and HTTPS and how HTTPS secures communication using encryption. We also learned about web hosting, which allows websites to be stored on servers and made accessible on the internet. Then we looked at the difference between front-end and back-end and how they work together using a real example, a user login process. We also discussed the difference between static and dynamic websites. And finally, we saw how a browser renders a web page by processing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to display the final web page on the screen. If you're learning web development and found this video helpful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Practical Full Stack, because this series will guide you step by step from a beginner to a full stack developer. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.